It's time for the Bible. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby, God blasted on the spot. Ghost, friends, it's time for the Bible. Boy, is it cold here in the old Bible Geek homestead. Heat's off, or at least necessarily pretty low. It's incredibly cold, and it's been so cold I haven't really been able to venture out of the bed to do some geeks lately, but though I'm a bit chilly, I'm gonna steadfastly get to some questions today. Been missing them. So here's one. Let's see, from Jeff. It says, my question concerns Mormon interpretations of the Bible, specifically the meaning of the earth was divided from Genesis 10:25. Some Mormons seem to think this verse refers to a divide or split in the covenant line, linking Joktan to both the Jaredites and the Yucatan Peninsula. What are your thoughts on this interpretation? Well, of course, it's forced and absurd. There is no hint of such a thing. I mean, how would anybody in biblical times know about anything that happened with the Western Hemisphere, even if the events of the Book of Mormon are true? I mean, there's nothing about anybody faxing their latest prophecies over to the Holy Land, and nothing in the context suggests it. In fact, though it's not clear what it's supposed to mean, it seems more likely to me that this is an alternate version of the Tower of Babel business, trying to explain how the earth was first divided into nations and languages, so it seems to me that's much closer to home and more natural, though it's certainly still a debatable view. I think the Mormon suggestion, however, does not rise to that degree of plausibility. Also, Jeff says, do you think that the Apostle Thomas going to preach in India, as in the Acts of Thomas, is a garbled historical memory that the celibacy gospel, which is, promoted in the Acts of Thomas, was imported into Christianity from Buddhism? It might be, but I mean, anything's possible, and often these things do have a kind of a hidden, double meaning, a coded meaning. I don't mean that it's intended as an allegory, but as I think you're suggesting, the notion that somehow the truth has gotten heavily garbled as it was misunderstood and re-understood, but not to the degree that one cannot surmise the original point. And you could be right about that point. However, I think the probability of it is mitigated a little bit by the fact that if early Christians did get the celibacy gospel ultimately from Buddhism, they didn't get it immediately from Buddhism. If Christian Lindner and others are right, as they may well be, the Buddhist missionaries to the West may well have triggered the creation of celibate ascetical Judaism, as we hear of the Essenes and so on, and the Therapeutai, who may originally have been the Theravadins and so forth. I'm guessing the Encretite Christians would have gotten it from them. But who knows? Because another thing you can point out is that the Manichaeans in the 3rd century were big celibacy gospel fans, and they certainly knew about Buddhism, and Mani, the apostle, was explicitly connected with it. He said he was I guess you could say, the reincarnation of the same spirit who had already appeared in the world as Zoroaster, Jesus, and the Buddha. So, there was a living consciousness in certain circles of a possible link with Buddhism. So who knows? You could well be right. I don't know how one would verify it, but it's certainly a good possibility worth looking into. Good thinking. Here's one that I don't think I have much of an answer for, but it's so interesting I want to share it anyway. This is from Jason. He says, on a recent vacation to Italy, I visited the Vatican along with thousands of other people, where I, of course, saw Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel paintings. Even if someone hasn't been to the Vatican, most are probably aware of or familiar with some of these paintings, in particular the painting of Adam, Eve, and the serpent at the Tree of Knowledge. It was explained to me once by a die-hard traditional Christian that this painting was actually subversive and that Michelangelo used this scene to forward his occult belief that it was actually oral sex performed on Adam by Eve, which was what the knowledge of good and evil was all about, gasp. Certainly Adam and Eve's positioning in the painting lends credence to this idea, with Adam standing and stretching for the fruit while Eve sits on a rock facing him at waist level as the serpent is wrapped around the tree. At the time I initially heard this theory, I was a true believer and thought to myself, what an SOB Michelangelo was for having the gall to believe this, much less taunt worshippers to their face with this devilry. Well, I've since lost my faith. Hallelujah. He said it, not me. One of the greatest things that's ever happened to me, may 100 flowers bloom, and thankfully had lost it by the time I went to Italy so that I could appreciate what this master had accomplished. It was heroic, really, and not just in this particular scene, but painting the Christian god as Jove, or Jupiter/Zeus, and then incorporating facets of ancient mythology in nearly all of his religious artwork. He thumbed his nose at the church right in the middle of the Christian seat of world power. I came away with a true appreciation for what legends like Michelangelo and Da Vinci gave to Western civilization and the world at the risk of their own necks. Anyway, do you think this was secretly what Michelangelo was communicating with this painting? I couldn't help but be reminded of it when you discussed that the gods of creation in Genesis did not want these humans reproducing and usurping their power. Did Michelangelo have an understanding, if not explicit knowledge, of the various origins of the Genesis creation myth? Maybe just a vague idea? If so, how would he have come to know or believe this? And what a strong belief it must have been to be for him to be so forthcoming about it. Was he also showing an awareness that Yahweh or Jehovah could be seen as a form of Jove, since the pronunciation in Latin for Jove would have sounded like Yahweh or Yahweh? In my high school Latin classes, I was taught that the Latin V was pronounced as RW. I'm probably stretching with that last connection, although I do think he used Jove to symbolize one of the gods of Genesis. What are your thoughts on all this? Is the supposition that Michelangelo meant for the painting to show this hidden knowledge incorrect? Is it just a coincidence? I'm certainly open to other possibilities. If this is true, I find it remarkable that the truth behind the Genesis myth has likely been known for centuries, albeit in underground channels, before any of the ancient J, E, D, or P manuscripts were ever discovered. Well, I don't know where this theory comes from. It's possible, anything's possible, but this smacks a little bit to me of Da Vinci Code kind of stuff. Unless there's some recondite statement in some medieval, or I guess Renaissance source about this, I would doubt it. I think that the way you described the scene, I don't remember it. It seems like it may be reading an awful lot in. And of course, the another problem is that, according to the interpretation of the knowledge of good and evil that I espouse, the point is not sex, period, but sex leading to procreation, which, of course, oral sex would not do. So even if this is correct, opinion about what he was trying to get across, he's still not getting the real point that Yahweh and his fellow gods didn't want the competition by a burgeoning race of, in effect, rival gods. But anything's possible. I just think the links are pretty weak on this one. But there were plenty of medieval heresies, so-called, and you never know who knew what about them. It's no stretch in that sense. Richard Olson from Harrington, Kansas, says, a brief Google search informs me that the Bible mentions suicide only 7 times. I've not personally fact-checked any claims I read in my tiny sample. A task already accomplished by an expert like the Bible Geek. I don't know about that. There is no implied biblical textual judgment of the act prior to writings with the signature of Paul, and that it was several centuries before suicide emerged as sinful and abhorrent in Christian doctrine. Is there any particular reason attention was suddenly focused on this subject by relatively early Christian-era authors? For example, perhaps a period of abnormally high suicide rate within a particular population? I don't think there's anything in any of the Pauline or Paulinist writings that bears on that, except possibly an ambiguous passage in, oh boy, I can't believe, it's 1st or 2nd Corinthians, and where it says that God will not permit you to be tested beyond your capacity, but will provide a way out, vaguely. But it's less clear than my paraphrase, and I'm not sure if they're trying to say that that you must not give up hope and perhaps commit suicide, because don't worry, the cavalry's going to come in, or God will give you extra strength. Or if, a la the Stoics, they're saying, well, look, don't worry about it, suicide's all right, if you're not expected to endure the unendurable. Actually, it seems to me it could mean either one of those things. King Saul is said to have fallen on his sword to avoid being captured and mocked and abused by the Philistines. That's not exactly what you usually consider suicide. I mean, technically, I suppose it is, but it's not like goodbye, cruel world. That's not the same thing. And eventually, I believe the reason suicide is a mortal sin in Catholicism is that it shows it's apostasy, basically. You're giving up on God, and because you're despairing, and that's the problem. When they reasoned that out, I don't know. I mean, there's a certain logic to it. It almost sounds like a kind of a theological scare tactic to convince people not to commit suicide, and of course I wouldn't condemn that, right? I want to get people not to commit suicide no matter what you have to tell them to do it. So I'm not really sure of that. It does occur to me that martyrdom was made to be such a glorified thing in early Christianity that warning against suicide could bear on that. Like, wait a minute, you got to give your life for Christ if you have to, but let's not be like Peregrinus, the cynic/Christian who purposely threw himself into a bonfire so that he would be considered a martyr. No. You can't do that. I mean, conceivably, the zeal of Ignatius the Martyr, as it's depicted in the fictive epistles of Ignatius, that makes the guy sound like a loony who just could not wait to be eaten by lions and so on. So it's possible there's a connection there. But I don't know really what historical factors led to that sudden emphasis. Let's see. Okay, this is from Commander Scotty in the Ann Arbor Galaxy. It says, here's a sentence from Burton Mack's A Myth of Innocence. Oh, what a great book. Where he's speaking about the Jesus group. You know, Mack divides the early Christians into Christ cults and Jesus movements. I think that's an excellent way of doing it, and I try to follow up on that in my book, Deconstructing Jesus. Okay, let me start over again, sorry. Here's a sentence from Mack's A Myth of Innocence, where he is speaking about the Jesus group, the Jesus movement he calls the Congregation of Israel. And Mack says, collections of miracle stories have been discovered among the Jesus traditions used to compose the Gospels of Mark and John. Because they're collections and because they betray a certain kind of meditation on Jesus' activity, they are evidence for yet another early Jesus movement. End of quote. I'm curious about the logic here, specifically the idea of moving from miracle stories to some, quote, real, unquote, group of people behind them. Do you think this a licit move or not? How could we ever know for sure, I mean? Well, of course, you can't know for sure, and that's true of so many of these questions that I think it's pretty dangerous to say, oh, well, this is one of the assured conclusions of higher criticism. Fundamentalists, who are anti-critics, of course, used to say, hey, look, those critics used to say this was definitely so, but now archaeology shows they were wrong. So much for the assured conclusions of higher criticism. Well, yeah, that's true, though I'm not sure how assured some of these things were. I think all along Wellhausen and Bauer and all these guys realized they were just given the best available reading of the evidence and that new evidence could overturn things. But there are some things thought to be certain that probably a little premature. Everything has to be tentative and provisional. But I think he's got a good point. He's pointing out an unusual thing about these, really, I think, three versions of the same miracle catena or chain that Paul J. Achtemeier points out. And there's like two versions in Mark of a sequence of a sea miracle, I think an exorcism, a food miracle, warning against the Pharisees, and one or two other things. They're in somewhat different orders, or the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. I mean, that's almost the same story told twice. The others are not quite as close, but are kind of equivalent in different ways. And then if you look over at the signs source in the Gospel of John, again, they're not exactly the same, but you've got the healing of the royal official's servant, just like you've got in the miracle chains in Mark, and the multiplication of loaves and fishes, a sea miracle, walking on the water, so on and so on. And it looks like somebody had grouped together these miracles for some reason. Why? Because it's not like just random stuff here and there. Oh, there's a parallel over here and way over there. No, they're like, they seem to be chains, self-contained series of miracles. And Mack points out that, despite what John says, that there are many miracles here, but I've chosen these so that you may know that Jesus is the Christ and so forth. Well, that's got to be redactional. Well, it might as well be. I mean, there's no way to know. But despite that, there's nothing messianic about any of these various miracles. They're all reflective of traditions of Moses, Elijah, and Elisha. And Mack says, who would have been Jesus fans who would not be trying to show that he was the Messiah? That seems odd. I mean, it's a similar argument to what Mac says about Q. This doesn't really sound very Christian. There's nothing really distinctively Christian about this. What kind of, quote, Christians, unquote, would have circulated this material? Well, the same thing here. And the miracle chains, that implies you've got non-messianic Jesus people, and I think, I try to explain in Deconstructing Jesus that this might well be a good candidate for the Galilean Christianity, so-called, which Walter Schmidholz and others talk about. And that would make sense because the Galileans would hark back to the northern kingdom, the traditions of Israel, which notoriously had no room for David because of this dust-up between King Rehoboam, Solomon's successor, and the northern tribes under Jeroboam, and they split. And the north, they said, okay, we got no stake in the house of David, to hell with them. And so you have the Samaritans, who were northerners, looking forward to a kind of a second coming of Moses, the Taheb, the restorer. And you've got all these traditions about Elijah returning, and but not Davidic messianism. And I think that's where the passage in Mark comes from also, where Jesus taunts the scribes and says, so the Messiah is supposed to be David's descendant, his son, is he? Well, then explain to me how David, who wrote, as they thought, Psalm 110, could refer to the anointed Messiah as his son. The Lord, no, as his Lord, I should say. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. My Lord, they took that to mean the Messianic king, and they thought David wrote the psalm. So how is it possible, given the traditions of Israel and of Jews, that you could imagine David saying that his son and ultimate heir is his Lord? Now, that wouldn't happen. And that seems to be the implicit logic. And so what's the point? The Messiah is not David's son. You guys are wrong about that. Which, this sounds kind of like what the Hasmonean dynasty would have said. Yeah, we're not Davidic. That's true. We're Levitical, but we're the Messianic kings nonetheless. Well, I think this kind of argument was employed at some point on behalf of Jesus by Galilean Christians who didn't accept Davidic messianism. And so there are hints of such a kind of Christianity, a Jesus movement that was non-messianic. And I think Mac is definitely in the right direction on that, as far as can be judged. Right, there's no way to prove this. It just seems like the most likely of the possibilities. It makes sense of some odd things if this is true. So can't prove it, but that you can't make the mistake of apologists and say, well, some speculative theory can't be proven, and therefore we can just ignore it. We've refuted it by pointing out that it can't be definitively proven. We're just going to go back to sleep now. That's not the way to go. But of course, it is speculative and can't be proven. Precious little of this stuff can be. Thanks, Commander Scotty. Go have a pulled pork sandwich for me in Famous Dave's out there in the galaxy. Okay. I was going to mention this before, but sponge, a sieve-like mind that I have, I kind of forgot. Mentioning Burton Mack reminds me of a piece of bad news I got. Professor Mack, in his great books like The Myth of Innocence, has, I think, been carrying forward in a brilliant way the work of Helmut Kester and James M. Robinson in their collection of articles trajectories through early Christianity. Of course, they've both written plenty of other books, but this particular book was groundbreaking in its approach, and I think that that approach has been taken further by Mack, further in the same direction. Well, speaking of Helmut Kester, he and Robinson are both disciples of Bultmann. Kester is, I think he's probably in his 80s, but he's in the hospital and is about to go home, but without much hope of recovery from cancer. And I fear he will not be with us much longer, and I'd just like to say I'm glad he is with us for whatever time remains to him. I just sent him a copy. I had the great privilege of being in one of his classes at Harvard Divinity School. Oh, it was a great one. Team taught by Helmut Kester and Harvey Cox. I love both those guys and their work. Heresies, Ancient and Modern. Man, it was great. And I thought such a privilege to study with these guys. Well, he wouldn't remember me after all this time, but I sent him a copy of the Human Bible, New Testament, and wrote in there how thrilled I was to have even the most tangential association with him, and how grateful I am for his work, and so forth. So I fear he will not be with us for long, but luckily he still is, and what a great scholar and pioneer. Let's see. Okay. This is from Jason Jablonski. Let's see. I knew a Joe Jablonski once, but okay. I was talking to a creationist about the Earth, and he stated this verse, in his mind, prove that God is real, and it's exactly evident in this verse that Earth is floating in the universe. How would that prove there's a God? Well, it's the old thing where, science didn't know this until recent times, and the Bible writers already knew it. How would they have, unless the Holy Spirit told them? So I'm sure you've come across this question before, and I wanted to ask your opinion. I mentioned gravity and assumed that in this time Earth might be thought of like a Mount Olympus type floating chunk of land, not spinning or doing anything. What's your thought on this claim? And here's the passage. Job 26, verse 7, New International Version. He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. Well, actually, I think this reflects ancient cosmology, not modern. Because the northern skies, the actual word is Zaphon, which is almost certainly one of several references to Mount Zaphon, the Mount of the Assembly of the Gods, in the north of Palestine, which was very important in Ugaritic and other mythologies, and again is mentioned in the Bible. Sometimes Mount Zion is associated with it. Same cosmological idea. It's like Mount Olympus, as you say. Well, you didn't say it, but that just shows how much you were on the right track. It's a cosmic mountain, the axis mundi, connecting heaven and earth. And let's see. What is the empty space over which it is suspended? Well, that is tohu, the same word translated as the deep in Genesis 1, the ocean depth, upon which God causes the earth to float like a disk once he clears some of the water off it. And then what is the idea of hanging the earth over nothing? Well, that I think is the same thing. This is Hebrew parallelism, a poetic gimmick they used all the time. And so to say that you say the same thing in slightly different ways, it's great stuff, very effective. Well, on the one hand, he establishes Mount Zaphon. That's in Isaiah 14, right? I will ascend to Mount Zaphon, the sides of the north in the King James, and be like God and so on. Okay, so he puts the cosmic mountain over empty space, or over the ocean of chaos, the Tehom. And he suspends the earth likewise over the nothing. Well, again, the formlessness, without form and void. So I think this is ancient cosmology, not modern. Excuse me. I'm one of those cold demons. And even if, however, somebody were saying the earth is a sphere and is just suspended in the void in the modern sense, that doesn't mean it's revelation. It would just mean it's a different ancient cosmology. I mean, there were people eventually that thought the earth was a sphere and stuff like that. They just didn't influence Christianity much. There were various ancient cosmologies and cosmological theories. I believe the Pythagoreans believed that the Earth and all the other planets and the Sun orbited a great cosmic furnace. Well, he was pretty darn close to the truth. These guys didn't have observational technology, and they just thought it out. And so you could have simply another ancient cosmology. They don't have nearly the detail to persuade us that this was something else. Let me just give you, by contrast, a different example that you would, I think, have to take seriously, as crazy as it sounds, because of a number of detailed correspondences. This book, The Spaceships of Ezekiel, which has come up, though not recently, on the Bible Geek before. This guy is a NASA engineer, and somebody said, take a look at the wheel of Ezekiel during his vision. What do you make of this? And I think they already they suggested to him the now old theory that this was a flying saucer. Well, he thought this was just kookery. But he looked at it and said, son of a gun, all these weird images and symbols and descriptions do sound like a very plausible, workable aerial vehicle. And he goes into great detail and shows how. This guy's not some member of the Urantia book group or the these UFO sects and stuff like that. I don't know that he made anything of it, really, but he said, I got to admit, well, now, okay, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I have no way of knowing, but that, I think, despite one's initial distaste for it as a secular rationalist beating anomalous data to death like baby seals, you would have to show why that's wrong, why there's a more natural interpretation that fits the cultural framework, and that's probably been done, but nonetheless, you'd have your work cut out for you. This, I don't think you would. It's not detailed enough to say, this can't just be what the ancients guessed, but I don't think there's any reason to think that. It seems to fit pretty darn well with a flat earth floating on the Tehom business you find elsewhere, especially even in the context of that passage in Job. The rest of it is very clearly about ancient cosmology, the firmament being held up by great pillars and all that stuff. Okay, this is from a fish. I regularly listen to your podcast and consider myself a Protestant Christian of some kind with a basically conservative mindset. Your podcast gives me an opportunity to examine the layers of traditions which cloud my understanding of the Bible and to critically examine what my beliefs really should or could be. A far cry from the silly propaganda I get out of more orthodox sources. So I want to ask, do you think mainline Christian denominations would benefit by presenting from the pulpit the type of information you present in your podcast? I believe this could be a source of moral edification for our society, as it seems to be for me. We know this is faith, so why not present the more difficult points of faith for what they are, and freely consider the results of 200-plus years of biblical criticism? Well, now, it depends on what you mean by mainline churches. the majority of Protestant churches are probably evangelical, fundamentalist, Pentecostal, etc., and you're just going to be cutting off your nose to spite your face. You're just going to lose your job because people don't want to hear this. They make a fetish of the doctrine of inerrancy and will perceive what you and I understand to be an elucidation of biblical difficulties. Yeah, sure, it looks like a contradiction because it's two different sources with different ideas being preserved and juxtaposed. Okay, so you mean the writer's not just a stupid fool who couldn't keep his story straight. This is really a scrapbook of ancient traditions. Okay. Now, I've had students from a conservative background who love to hear stuff like that because it solves these Bible questions that they had no clue about and that the doctrine of inerrancy didn't allow them to have a clue about. They would just say, well, one day we'll get to heaven and find out then. Yeah, good luck with that. As if you're going to care about such a thing, even if there is a heaven to get to. But I would say with most evangelicals, they're immediately going to smell blood in the water and say, hold on a minute. If this is just a record of ancient opinions, well, how do we know that's not the case with the Gospels or the Epistles of Paul? No. That can't be authoritative. Now, in liberal Protestantism, they came to that position a long time ago, like Harry Emerson Fosdick and C.H. Dodd and people like that said, yeah, the inspiration in the Bible is that many of its writers were often, quote, inspired, unquote. They were religious geniuses. But the text as such being dictated by God or the equivalent, nah. But, of course, liberal Protestants weren't big on dogmatic theology of any kind. They all tended toward the idea, the kind of Enlightenment European Kantian idea that religion is really about morality. Well, that's not good enough for evangelicals who want to tell themselves they have reason to believe in specifics like the resurrection of the dead, that of Jesus in the past, that of Christians in the future. They know good and well there's no other evidence for that. You could speculate about it, but that wouldn't make it true. They need to believe in a kind of a magic book that says, okay, this is it, I heard it from God, and this is what you ought to believe in. That's what they want because of the kind of beliefs they want to entertain. They want a theological system that they can say comes from the mouth of God. And so I think most of them are not open to this kind of thing. You solve the Bible's problems by showing that it's a human book. That if it's inspired, it's not in really a meaningful way because it doesn't guarantee either accuracy of narrative or uniformity of opinion among the biblical writers. And so I know some find it edifying. I think you're taking your job into your hands because many are not going to like it and cannot really benefit from it in the way we do. I would, when I was a pastor preaching to a fairly liberal congregation, I avoided a lot of this stuff from the pulpit and saved it for classes I taught because I just felt that it wasn't really edifying. I would zero in on edifying, exhortational material in the Bible or passages that raised interesting issues and kind of try to do an essay about whatever the subject was, bringing to bear on it wisdom from the Bible. But even there, with people that weren't fundamentalists by and large, I figure there are certain things that belong in the classroom, not in the pulpit on Sunday morning. And so that's another reason I'm a little hesitant about that. But on the other hand, in general, I think it is important that people that find the Bible so important have a more and more realistic idea of it. It's just that it's difficult to get that across. A lot of people, probably most, just don't want to hear it. So I guess it's a question of what venue one picks to offer this. So, real good question. I mean, it is so liberating and illuminating to know this stuff, but I have to admit, it makes faith, whatever it is, more subjective and arbitrary, and some people just can't stand that. Let's see. Who is this one from? This is kind of a long one. Christine Maxwell. Yeah, let's see, a long-time listener. I was wondering what your thoughts are on John 2:20. It's taken 46 years to build this temple. You're going to rebuild it in 3 days. Do you think that the Jews are referring to the original second temple finished in the 6th year of Darius, I think, or Herod's renovated temple? This is a hard scripture for me to jive with the mysticism argument, only because Christians try to use this to date Jesus' ministry and death in the 30s. I know that John couldn't have heard this discussion firsthand, so I wonder why it was included at all, other than to have Jesus mention the resurrection of his body in 3 days. But where did the 46 years come from, and why? It seems as if the early Christians used the Old Testament information to interpret their new beliefs, and one thing on Bible Hub seemed to show that there is a way to justify what this scripture may have meant to the original, to justify that this scripture might have meant the original second temple. Here's Matthew Poole's commentary. The Jews understood his words of that material temple in which they at this time were, which the best interpreters think was the temple built by Ezra and Zerubbabel, but how to make it out that it was 46 years building, they are not well agreed. Some say Cyrus reigned 30, Cambyses 8, Darius 6. These added together make 44. Others say that the Magi reigned 2 years more. Some reckon to Cyrus 31, to his son Cambyses 9, to Darius 6. Others say that the years wherein the building was hindered during Artaxerxes' time, a la Ezra 4:21, added to the 2 years of Darius, Ezra 4:24, in whose 6th year it was finished, are reckoned together. The Jews thought it strange that our Savior should undertake in 3 days to rear a building which had cost their forefathers so many years. Then Gill's exposition, then said the Jews unto him, as read the Syriac, Arabic, Persic, and Ethiopic versions, 46 years was this temple in building, which cannot be understood if the temple is built by Solomon, for that was but 7 years in building, 1 Kings 6:37, but rather the temple is built by Zerubbabel, who sounds like a Flintstones character, commonly called the Second Temple, and might be more properly said to be this temple. The calculations of this made by learned men are various and endless to recite. Daniel's 7 weeks, or 49 days, which are so many years, can have nothing to do with this account, since they regard not the building of the temple, but the city of Jerusalem. Though from the 2nd year of Cyrus, in which the temple began to be built, to the 32nd of Darius exclusive, were just 46 years. Cyrus reigning 3 years, Artaxerxes, or as Ahasuerus, 14 years, and Artaxerxes Darius 32. But their account is more likely, which begins at the first of Artaxerxes Longimanus, who reigned 40 years, and ends in the 6th year of Darius, his successor, in which year the temple was finished, Ezra 6:15. He then goes on to think it actually. He then goes on to say that he thinks it actually refers to Herod's temple, but at least included this previous information. If we were to go with Herod's temple, would the gospel writer be interjecting this story during this particular time, as it was felt that Jesus should be around in the 30s due to a reinterpretation of Daniel, since it was originally written for the time of the 170s BC? BCE, whatever. Then nothing happened, so people had to find different dates to work from. They used different authorizations to build than the Cyrus Edict. I could certainly see how people thought the Messiah would have to come around this time. Lastly, if you go with the historicist theory, you could still see a man thinking he is the Messiah based on Daniel and actually being alive in the 30s, and then the gospel writer putting this little conversation in to address his 3-day resurrection. I would really appreciate your thoughts on this, as you have a lot of expertise in understanding Scripture and what it really means versus what the apologists want it to mean. Christine, I think it has to be Herod's temple, because this temple, right, that's what it says, the one they're standing in. And why mention the 46 years? Well, here I think Alfred Loisy was correct, and that he had surmised what it was that led Irenaeus, not long after the composition of this gospel, to posit that Jesus died at the age of 50. And now, under the reign of the Emperor Claudius, what is this? Now, notice that, this whole thing is written for the reader. It's winking to the reader, constant references like the triumphal entry. Oh yeah, it was the fulfillment of this prophecy. Not that anybody knew it at the time, but later we saw this and that. Well, in what's happened here, the point is that Jesus says, or I should say, the evangelist says, he was talking about the temple of his body. And Loisy says that's a hint that the 46 years it took to build this temple, this body, is the age of Jesus at the time of this scene, according to the narrative. And then after this, we have 3 Passover suppers in the Gospel, 3 Passover holidays in the Gospel of John, which is why most people say John implies at least a 3-year ministry for Jesus. Well, what do you got then? Jesus must be 49 when he's crucified, in John's mind. And if that's his implicit Christology, that's the point of it. And I tend to think that's right. It works out a little too well. But as to which temple it is, in terms of the narrative, before we get to the big wink to the reader that I've just tried to explain, they must be referring to Herod's temple, and because this temple, I'm not even sure why there would be an argument for that. Let's see. This is from Kenneth of Norway. He says, from a talk Richard Carrier gave, I picked up that he had abandoned the Q hypothesis in favor of the idea that Matthew used Mark as his source, and Luke used Matthew, claiming also that more and more scholars are tending toward this view. Names he mentioned in favor of his view were Mark Goodacre, Barbara Shellard, and Michael D. Goulder. I was wondering what you think of this. Is it true a growing number of scholars are leaving the Q hypothesis behind? And do you see any particular weaknesses in the Q hypothesis yourself? Well, I'm sure he's right, and my impression is that, more are hearkening to these other theories, this one and the notion that Luke used Mark, and that Matthew used Luke and Mark, or that Mark used Luke and Matthew. I think all of them are being argued these days. But you know how in commercials they say, this is the fastest growing type of car or insurance company or whatever? They're sort of trying to get you to think that this has now taken the lead, or that it's even the major one of whatever it is. But that's not what they're saying, right? All they can actually say is, we appear to be growing at a faster rate than the other ones, the other companies or car brands or whatever. Now, that might mean something, but it doesn't mean it's the majority position. Now, whether or not it is the majority position, that has nothing to do with who's right. Of course, there are a lot of reasons people start finding a new hypothesis to look good. Sometimes they just find, wow, I never thought of this. This is kind of fascinating, and will jump on the bandwagon. But I wouldn't have any idea who's motivated that way, if anybody is, but I wouldn't be surprised. But of course, it comes down to the arguments, and I personally find the Q hypothesis, the Q model or whatever, by far the most plausible way of explaining the specific differences between the three synoptic gospels. Again and again, the differences between them seem more naturally explicable, that is, without resorting to ad hoc hypotheses and stuff. The problem with well, I guess the two supposed problems with Q are that there are a number of places, the so-called minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark, where on the traditional Q hypothesis, well, of course, Q is hypothetical, and that's the second problem, but you can't actually compare Matthew and Luke with their source when the source is not Mark, but when you can, when Mark is the on this reading, the source, there are a couple of places where Matthew's version and Luke's version agree with each other in a passage that parallels Mark, but on the whole, but Mark doesn't have what they have. Now, where did they get it? And in that case, this alternate type of hypothesis starts looking good. Well, okay, maybe Mark was original, and Matthew changed this, and Luke was reading both Matthew and Mark, so sometimes his differences from Mark represent his own redactional changes, but sometimes he's simply preserving Matthew's changes. Oh, well, that does make sense, but it doesn't make enough sense of the majority of cases, in my opinion, where it makes more sense. It's more of an economical, natural explanation to say it looks like Matthew and Luke are independently changing Mark in the ways that seemed best to each one. So what do you make of those oddball passages, though, where Matthew and Luke appear to agree against Mark? Well, to me, it seems very likely. I think B.H. Streeter and others already said this. It's not original with me by any means. That what you have here very likely is cases of scribal assimilation. What's that now? Well, that the scribes were very conversant with the texts of the Gospels, and sometimes as they were rote copying, they would just unwittingly go with what they remembered hearing, since there is so much word-for-word correspondence between the three synoptics, and they would inadvertently, oh yeah, I know it comes next, but it didn't. They were thinking of Luke, but they're copying Matthew, and so what do you know? Matthew winds up sounding more and more like Luke. There's a major instance where you can see from the textual tradition that this happened, and that's the Lord's Prayer. In the earliest manuscripts, it's a good bit shorter in Luke than in Matthew, but as you go later and later in the textual tradition, you find that what do you know? It's looking more. Luke is getting longer. It's looking more and more like Matthew. Luke originally just said Father, whereas Matthew had Our Father who art in heaven. Well, eventually, Luke reads that way. And these petitions that are missing from Luke, but in Matthew, wind up being added to Luke. And so eventually you have in Luke the same thing as in Matthew, with the single difference that I think Luke has forgive us our debts, whereas Matthew has forgive us our trespasses. But other than that, it's the same. Well, that's a case where we know, I think we can be sure to, in our surmise, that copyists weren't really trying to change it. But they could have been. They could have said, gee, it's shorter in Luke. That can't be right. I guess the idiot that was copying this before me must have left stuff out. Let me put it back in. That could have happened. But more innocently, it could have been, well, that's innocent, just, erroneous. But the scribe could have just figured, oh, yeah, I know the Lord's Prayer. And he's inadvertently adding to Luke things that weren't in there. I mean, we can tell that happened. Just look at the manuscripts. So to me, it is not an ad hoc hypothesis to get Q off the hook by saying, well, it's probably what happened in these other cases. And one other thing to beat this to death, why is it that Luke and Matthew have Jesus respond to the high priest, you say that I am, when he says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Mark has, I am. What? Wait a minute. You mean to how is it possible that if Matthew and Luke are rewriting Mark, and Mark had this forthright declaration, this unambiguous affirmation, I am, that Luke and Matthew independently both changed it to this quibbling, if you say so? What do you know? There are a couple of manuscripts of Mark that preserve a reading where Jesus just says, you say so. Well, to me, that closes the case. Matthew and Luke must have been reading a text of Mark that read that way, with this equivocation. So they've read something that we don't have in most copies of Mark. And there, well, I guess that's the other way of explaining these agreements, that Mark originally did agree with the version we find shared by Matthew and Luke. And that I take to be another example of that. The other major problem people seem to have with Q is that we don't have a copy of it. I don't see that as any argument whatsoever. To me, that just is a hidden example of canon anxiety. Why is it implausible that there was this document widely known at the time and available to Matthew and Luke that has since disappeared? What is the problem with that? And especially since it's easily explicable how it would have. If Matthew and Luke both used most of Q, as the theory says they did, it's pretty easy to see how people would eventually say, why keep copying Q? You've got it in these other documents. We got a copy anyway. Then why didn't they drop Mark? Because they also each use most of Mark, right? Well, if Mark is the gospel of the Roman church, and there's some pretty good reasons to think so, it's the clout of the church at Rome that assured the continued copying of that gospel. So I don't see any real problem with this. Plus, well, two other problems I have with these kind of theories. Where do you think Luke got all the so-called L material? I mean, Luke, suppose Matthew used Mark and Luke used both of them. There's still loads of Lucan material that isn't in either one of them. Where'd he get that? Now, he might have just made a lot of it up, and in fact, I think he did. But you've got the same problem with Q. Is this much of Luke based on some other source we don't have anymore? The L source. Well, that's not implausible, but if you think Q is implausible, you got to make the same question about that. Was there an M source? Well, we don't have that independently. What's the big deal? So to me, that seems like a chimera, just a fantasy. The second big problem I have is that it is, given the way other redactional changes are fairly minor between the synoptics, to suddenly say that, let's say, Luke rewrote Matthew's magi into shepherds, or vice versa. What? That's just too much. That just doesn't seem to be the way these guys did it. So I mean, there's a precious little similarity between them, and I just find that implausible. The idea that Mark abridged both Matthew and Luke together, that seems to me crazy, because you mean to tell me he had Gospels that had both nativity stories and resurrection stories and the Sermon on the Mount or Plain, and he cut that stuff out? It's just inexplicable. So I'm a Q man myself. I think it's the way to go on that. Let's see. Just one more from Matthew, presumably not the evangelist. This guy's pretty old. I recently stumbled upon your podcast and have found it to be a wonderful resource. I was talking recently with a very well-educated relative about the doctrine of hell. He basically asserted that the modern view of hell as eternal punishment is a result of St. Anselm and what he calls medieval errors. He claimed that Eastern Christians understood the metaphorical language of the Bible better than their Western counterparts, and that despite quotes from Eastern Church fathers such as Clement Ignatius and Polycarp indicating belief in eternal punishment, they were simply using the same metaphorical language as the Bible, and read in context they were annihilationists. What's your take on this? Did early Christians have a more humane and slightly less nonsensical view of post-mortem judgment than we do today? Which, if any, particular doctrine concerning does a fair reading of the relevant texts vindicate? Well, there's a lot less on it than people might think. There is nothing in the epistles attributed to Paul about hell. 1 Corinthians 15, for instance, speaks of the resurrection of those who were saved. There's nothing about any continued afterlife of any kind for the unbelievers. They're going to face fiery judgment, the persecutors of Christians, like ISIS today, when Jesus comes back, but it doesn't say anything about a horrific afterlife. The stuff about Gehenna, that seems to, that Matthew has, well, there's some in Mark, it's based on Isaiah 66, but like the Hades stuff reflects passages in the Old Testament where you're talking about the destruction of cities and so forth. It's hard to know if more than that is intended. It seems like there is going to be torment after death in the use of the word Gehenna, but then again, that is a reference to an Old Testament belief that in Tophet, or the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom, the same place at the root of Mount Zion, there was a subterranean fiery chasm ruled over by the god Molech, to whom infants were offered in sacrifice. But that was a horrible way to die, but there was no thought that they were being tormented by devils with pitchforks. It was run by a big devil, but the notion is they perished. It's not suggested that they suffered consciously. And so I'm guessing that Gehenna might imply, as your friend said, annihilationism. The thing in Matthew 25, depart from me, ye cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Of course, he could be speaking to the devil and his angels. That's maybe why they're going to a place prepared for fallen angels, because they are. Maybe that's what's being said, as Hosea Ballou suggested. But even if it's just bad guys and sinners, it doesn't say that they're going to be tormented eternally, but rather the fire is never quenched. That does refer to the fire, not the people in it necessarily. And any idiot knows that something in the fire burns up. Unless you specifically say the opposite, like the burning bush in Exodus. Gee, that's odd, Moses says. It's burning but not consumed. It doesn't say that about hell. The closest thing you have to the mainstream conservative view of hell is in the book of Revelation, where it says specifically those who took the mark of the beast during the tribulation will be tormented day and night forever and ever. It doesn't even say all the unrighteous, right? It's this particular group. So it's the doctrine of hell, as you hear it today, is kind of a synthesis of bits and pieces, none of which is very explicit. But I don't see any reason to believe that there is merely figurative language for something more humane. Again, there's less language to worry about, as I've just tried to show, but to say that, as moderns do, assuming that it talks about torment in hell, to say that, well, that really means you're just going to wish you had repented when you had the chance, and darn it, I missed my opportunity to bask in the beatific vision for eternity. What a fool I was, and you're going to be recriminating yourself forever. C.S. Lewis sort of takes that view, or an interesting variant of it. To me, this is a crazy view, because who is it that would miss communion with God? People that sought it and had it on earth. Right? If you're some kind of profane sinner, you didn't give a damn about God or fellowshipping with Christ. You didn't care about that. You're going to suddenly care about it after you're dead? I mean, in the absence of tongue-gnawing agony, right? If it's just the fact that you missed out, then that means you have magically been changed by token of death from a Christ hater, a God hater, to a God lover. And because it's unrequited love, oh, if only I could be with God and with Jesus. You mean to say God has sanctified you by death just to torment you? Yeah, you stupid jerk. Now you love me, but I say to hell with you. That's perverse and ludicrous. I don't see people seeming to realize that. But as with most allegory, it's just a way of trying to turn bad texts into good ones, I think. So, okay, thanks, Matt. I'll come back with another one soon. I appreciate your listening to the old Bible Geek, and I'm going to go put on another layer or two of clothes. So I'll see you soon, fellow geeks.